welcome to our new series on inspiration of our work. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. We have invited you today to discuss your work and journey, but in particular to talk about the flame. For our audience, like Bill Isaacs is the founder and CEO of Dialogos, an author of Dialogue, The Art of Thinking Together. For the past 30 years, Bill has served as a leadership advisor, educator, an architect of systems transformation for CEOs, fund managers, development professionals, and national policy and political leaders. And at Imago, we're very, very inspired by your contributions and teaching. I think he had the opportunity to work directly, or to teach directly Isabel, which is one of our founders. And we feel like a lot of the thinking through Dialogos truly informs our thinking and how we approach working with organizations. So that is one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Just, to have a little bit of context, and, how did you come up with the idea that eventually became Dialogos? What was your journey leading up to that moment? Where were you in your personal and professional life then? And, what is the core idea behind the Dialogos inception?
Well, I'll say a couple of things first to just note and appreciate how Imago has taken this work in a very rich and beautiful way. There's something very instructive in what you've done and the way you've done it. And we'll come back to that, I think, some point in our conversation. Dialogos is a development lab, for lack of a better term. And we came up with the idea of it more than 25 years ago as a way to experiment with large systems transformation. We see lots of examples in the world of, individual points of leadership, sometimes in an enlightened and capable team. But you don't really see all that often large-scale shifts that sustain, changes that really not just happen, but happen in a remarkably powerful way and are sustainable. We became very interested in that and very interested in what does it take, because if we look around, we see increasing evidence of fragmentation in the world. We certainly saw that 25 years ago, and it's more present now than ever. What's present now, though, is awareness that maybe it's time to do something. More than that, I think, has been the case. Anyway, Dialogos was a sort of creative laboratory to bring something new into the world. And the core idea of it was dialogue. Dialogue is the art of thinking together. Dialogue is more than that. It's the allowing of a flow of new thinking and new feeling to arise when human beings interact. Most of us spend a lot of time in monologue, particularly in policy and development contexts. People show up in the meetings that they have, and one person speaks, and then somebody else speaks, and somebody else speaks, and they have their 3 points to make, and so on. You see monologue. There's a time and a place for that, but it's limited. Sometimes there's debate where people clash and get into arguments with each other, or try and shed light on something. Place for that too. Sometimes you move to discussion, where you really try to make a decision. Should we do this or should we do that? More analytic conversations. But there's more to human exchange and discourse than that. If all we do is monologue and debate and discussion, we don't make room for conversations where there's no ambition to make a decision at all, but to simply come to some kind of shared understanding, inclusive understanding, so that everyone involved knows what everyone else thinks, without trying to change anybody about anything. That's a first step towards dialogue. One can go further to engage together in ways that bring out ideas, bring out possibilities that no one would have thought of prior to stepping into the conversation. Conversations for possibility. The question is, when do we make space for that? We have monologue, and we have debate, and we have discussion. what about dialogue? It becomes obvious, I think, that we need more of it. Not only, and not always, but at certain times and certain places. So dialogos was intended to bring that understanding into high-level leadership contexts in the public sector and in the private sector.
That is incredible. It just so resonates with a lot of the work that we try to do at Imago with organizations, right? Like we always talk about co-creation, right? But like what we're saying about like human exchange, inclusive understanding, and truly the art of thinking together, of flow of a new thinking, of flow of a new feeling. It's so important in the work that we do with organizations every single day. Like from your perspective, what do you think are some of like key issues and challenges confronting organizations today and how they work? Because like, I mean, organizations sometimes are in itself like little ecosystems where this doesn't happen either.
Excuse me. Well, I think what is very obvious now, and people are saying this is a millennial generation wants these things, but I think it's something present forever, which is people want purpose in their work. They want a sense that what they're doing is purposeful. They make a living, but they make a difference. And increasingly, there's a sense of, why would I work for low wages in a context that I'm not happy about, where there's no purpose? So we're having the great resignation these days, as it's being called. People are quitting endlessly everywhere, at least in contexts where they have the privilege to do that. But I think more generally, I think what we're facing here is not only a desire to have purpose, but a recognition that organizations live in ecosystems, literal physical ecosystems, as in you have a carbon footprint and everybody either is contributing to the problem of the climate being stable and resilient for human life, or the opposite. But also the ecosystem in terms of all the stakeholders and in terms of all the people that are involved in the organizations that they encounter. And I think there's a recognition that you can be put out of business with a single tweet. Your reputation is present through every interaction. Every stakeholder, every part of the stakeholder system matters. And managers now have to pay attention to these things. This has always been true in development contexts. It's particularly true now in every context. All the separation between organizations is melting. And I think that's the third thing that I would say. If purpose is the first and recognizing an ecosystem is the second, I think we're in a moment of choice. I think people are having to make some choices about whether they're going to move towards a more expansive and contributive way of operating, or a more extractive and, frankly, a more exploitative way of operating. I think we're at a moment of choice. And organizations have to recognize that reality and respond.
Yeah, 100%. We were just having a workshop with one of the UN system, agencies, and it is so relevant what you are saying in terms of like a moment of choice. I think everyone is reckoning with that, even like at that high level of organizational reckoning. I think is what is happening. Hopefully more so.
I have a colleague who calls it a moment of reckoning, and I think that's a really good point. And I think in a lot of contexts, UN contexts and others, where, for instance, there have been a history of bureaucratic responses and so-called intractability and difficulty of making progress on any front, that the recognition is coming that we can't allow the mere fact of habits that have been stuck to keep us stuck. Just because it's been stuck doesn't mean it has to stay stuck. And there's a sort of there's a need for some grit here. What is it going to take to lift up out of what we've already accepted as limited and into something fundamentally new? That's the real choice.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is so true. And in a lot of the work that we do with organizations in terms of like helping them sometimes become aware of this moment and become aware of the importance of dialogue, we usually use the flame as a tool to sort of like facilitate that conversation. So like I'm really interested in understanding a little bit what was your inspiration for creating the flame, what led you to this realization that there is a fundamental misalignment sometimes between identity and action. Where was a moment or an organization where you observed this and you thought about it for the first time?
Well, perhaps to start with the flame and its conception, where it came from. I had been working with a very well-known physicist named David Bohm, who pointed to the fact that he's a quantum physicist. So he pointed to the fact that a lot of traditional understanding of the world had flown from or flowed from traditional understandings of physics, Newtonian physics, that the quantum world had upended all of that, and that conventional ideas about how reality is composed needed to change. It was more coherent, he noted, for us to talk about the world as an undivided whole, where there was no separation between the observer of phenomenon and the thing observed. It became very evident, in fact, through the experiments in quantum physics, that the observer would alter the observed, that the way the observer operated would literally change what could get measured. But it became more fundamental than that, that behind this undivided wholeness was an ongoing flow, and a sense that there was movement and flow prior to things. Our perception is, we look around the world, we see lots of things. We have a thingness perspective. But Bohm and the physicists of the day were saying, actually, a flow is more the underlying reality. Now, all our models and all our ways of operating tend to fragment, tend to divide this and that, operations and, research, and et cetera. Bohm was pointing to the need for some kind of more coherent view. So the flame was an attempt to try and understand this underlying integrated reality. The other key thing here was that the other key influence, I think, behind all this was that I spent many years working at MIT with the founders of a field called system dynamics. The systems thinking world sees the interconnectedness of things, sees the wholeness of things, and was a very practical modeling technology for connecting. But systems thinking, the way it was conceived of at MIT and in other contexts, was mostly about the external systems, the systems of things that connected things in an external sense. I became very aware of the fact that that was only part of the picture, that there's an internal reality too, and that the wholeness that I'm speaking about was both external and internal, and that it doesn't make sense to divide that. They're one thing. So we needed a way of understanding systems that was whole. So that was the impulse behind the flame.
Super interesting that it takes from physics and it takes from systems dynamics, which right now systems thinking, I feel is such a has become almost like jargon, for a lot of development professionals, without truly maybe understanding about the interconnectedness, right, beyond the external, right? Which I think is really interesting. The flame, as we were mentioning, as I was mentioning, is a tool that we often use at Imago, but for an audience that may be unfamiliar with it, can you describe a little bit what is the flame and unpack some of its elements for us?
Well, the flame model has 4 elements to it, and I can describe it very maybe simply at first, and then with more detail. If you think of music for a minute, you can think of music in several different ways. First, you can think of it in terms of the instruments, what instruments are playing. We can have a cello, we can have harpsichord, we can have violins, we can have an oboe. You can listen for the music, and as you listen, you can hear what the instruments are. Parallels what we call the level of the action in the flame model. The action is what people are doing. They're playing instruments. But there's a level below that. If you think of music, music tends to have a story, a structure, we would say. In other words, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But often there's themes, and the themes will repeat. And you can sit back and say, as I listen to this music, I can hear the storyline that flowed through it. Verses that repeated, or a story that flows through the ideas of the music, movements, if it's classical music, etc. You can hear the structure of the music. So that's another layer of the flame, the structure. Another way to get this distinction between action and structure, just to think about that for a second. We often use the image of a river and the patterns on the surface of the river. The surface of the river will have a swirling pattern on it, or will have a V. And if you take your hand and you move it through the pattern, you can interrupt the pattern. The minute you take your hand away, the pattern snaps back. You put your hand into the water, you interrupt the water. You take your hand away, the pattern snaps back. Why? Because there's structure under the surface of the river making the pattern appear. Now, a lot of managers are often like that. They intervene. They stop intervening, the pattern they were intervening in snaps back. Why? Because they didn't alter the structure that was producing it in the first place. What structure? In music, it's the measures. It's the pacing and the timing of it, and so on. In human systems, it's the physical setting. In a river, it's literally the shape of the riverbed and the rocks and stuff. It's the rules, vote on November 4th in the United States. There's a policy rules. Those are parts of the structure. We have lunch at noon, or unless you're in some countries where it's 2, or you have dinner at 6 if you're in America and have little kids, but in some countries it's 10 p.m. Different rules, different structures that produce, guess what? Different behavior, different action. But structure is also more complex, and there's emotional and mental structure. But then there's something below that. The question is, what's the quality of the atmosphere and the quality of energy and the mood that gives rise to, say, the feeling in music? If you think about music, there's the instruments, there's the structure, the storyline, but there's the mood, the feel. We talk about that as the tone. The tone is the quality of energy, the atmosphere, the thing that touches you when you walk into a room. And sometimes it's fraught and difficult. Sometimes it's lovely and energizing. Human beings are exquisitely perceptive to tone. Now, what's interesting is that tone is not just a sort of empty thing or just a nice feeling. Tone generates structure. Tone produces structure. How? If you took a bowl of water and you tap the edge of it, you immediately see rings that would flow in the water. If you took that same bowl and you hooked up a sound current to it, patterns would appear on the surface of the water. You should try it. It's quite something. Tone generates structure. Vibration generates structure. The vibration of our voices, our attitudes, our thoughts produce the structures we see around us. You can connect to this personally by thinking about the quality of the mood in a room. But as practitioners, as people who are interested in trying to have an impact on the world, it's very important to pay attention to the quality of the tone. We would say the quality of the field. Another word for the carrier wave of tone is the field or container in which the tone arises. Now, this is a vast subject, and it begins to get towards this thing we mentioned at the beginning of the internal. There's an enormous internal architecture and design that one can be perceptive to and influence. And that's being influenced, and you're being influenced by at all times. So that's the tone. And the last level we talk about as identity. Now, identity is the presence people have, who you're being. Action is what you're doing. Structure is how you're doing it. Tone is the mood or the quality of energy. Identity is who is acting. I'll say just a word about that. Identity is not just your outer identity, the package you came in, the culture, the race, the color, etc. It's the sense of presence of who you are. And while it includes those things, it goes well beyond them. We could say it's your sense of self, capital S. While we all have many parts to us, parts that react, parts that are noble, parts that aren't so noble sometimes, perhaps. At the center of each of us is a self, who you really are. Now, we sometimes get confused on this point. Sometimes we think we are our reactions, or we are our roles, but we're not. There's a presence behind all of that that has a quality of tone and generates certain kinds of structures and produces action in the world. This is true individually. It's also true collectively. We admire certain companies because they know who they are. Apple being an example, right? You're not confused about Apple. Apple knows who it is. You open up a box that comes from Apple. The identity of Apple is in the box. It's in the package, literally in the package itself, right? Identity generates the structures, which generates the tone, which generates the structures and then the action.
And in an organizational setting, like I think a lot of people usually talk about organizational culture. Like in the framework of the flame, where in the 4 levels of the flame do you locate the culture?
All of them.
All of them. All of them are vital.
We use the word culture, and it tends to be a bit vague, right? We tend to sort of not know what we mean. I think culture is all of those levels. It's the tangible activities that we do, and as my friend and colleague Ed Schein from MIT would put it, the artifacts, the physical level of things, the action level of things. But it's also the structure, which is the beliefs, the views, the mental models that people have. But it goes, and both what people say and also what they believe deeply. But it goes beyond that. It's the mood, the quality of feeling, how it feels around here. And it's who people are. Culture is all of it.
Super interesting. So when working with an organization, right? Especially I think in the development space, we have a lot of clarity when it comes to the outer layers of the flame, to the structures and about the actions, right? But working with organizations, on tone and identity, it's a little bit more complex. How do you usually tackle those?
Well, the most important question is one of leadership. Are there people in the organization who are aware that what goes on in them impacts what goes on out around them? Human beings are kind of like magnets, right? They draw certain things and they repel certain things. This is another metaphor to talk about the tonal and identity layers. What's the quality of the magnet in this organization? You can say that to people and they'll kind of get it. What's being drawn to you and what's being repelled, right? What's moving away? What's coming as quickly as possible and what's fleeing? All of this relates to the quality of the magnet, right? These are inner qualities. These are qualities that you may have inherited, but that you have some causal impact on. And the first message is one of taking responsibility for the quality of the magnet that is present in the organization, which, guess what, shows up in all kinds of large and small ways. Every touch point every staff person has, or every customer would have, say, conveys the quality of that magnet. That's true for every interaction. What's the leadership team doing about the quality of the magnet? That's one way to get at it. That relates, of course, to how people feel. Do they feel, driven, burnt out, or what? And then you can ask, well, what structures and factors are leading them to feel burnt out and stressed? And and to the degree that there's, creativity and positivity and happiness and so on, what structures or factors are leading to that? And how do we make that happen more readily? So this is very practical, actually. Burnout is a kind of classic, in entrepreneurial contexts, symptom of imbalance. In a lot of development organizations, there's often the feeling of pushing the rock up the hill. You never quite feel like you're getting where you want to go, even though you're working super hard, right? Well, what's the underlying tone here? Is it one of obligation? Are we thinking, is it a deficit model? Are we in scarcity? Do we think that there's not enough money, ideas, energy, quality, and so on? Do we, underneath it all, have a belief and therefore a feeling of scarcity? Like some organizations that succeed really well, including some of the ones I know that you guys work with, have a feeling of abundance, even though they don't have a lot of wealth. Their underlying feeling is joyous abundance with one another. They have plenty of things to work out in terms of how they operate. But the tone to them is something they actively cultivate and work on. Now, very few organizations are like that, but some are.
How do you cultivate tone in an organization?
One interesting story that we've been working with over the last little while is with an organization that's a hotel, the Ritz-Carlton. Right? They have the hotel industry is notorious for having lots of staff with paying low wages and lots of turnover, right? Well, at some point or other, Ritz took on a mantra. The mantra was, ladies and gentlemen, serving ladies and gentlemen. We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. In other words, the view was in this organization, in a lot of customer service organizations, the most important people are the customers, right? No, the most important people are our people. Now, everybody says that. Most people say that. These guys actually did something about it. They said, not only is it that we should treat them well, we should recognize them and honor them and respect them. And let that be the motto, the credo, they call it, that inform the organization. So they did. And they came up with a list of 10 or 12 very practical ways that this is then brought into existence. So so one of them is an example of one of them is, I look after the expressed and unexpressed needs of my guests. I look after the expressed and unexpressed needs of my guests, of the guests. Now that's very clear, not just what the customer or the guest is saying they want, but what they aren't saying, but they obviously also need. Now, and the idea is to empower all the staff with all of that. So there's 10 or 12 of these such things. And every staff person, every morning, all around the world, meets in small groups to talk about what happened the prior day and how that fit with the tone and quality of the culture that they're seeking to create. Every single day, every single staff person. And they have to make meaning. They have to say, what happened and how does that fit with the quality of the culture we're trying to create? That's how you create tone.
I was going to ask about, the process of diagnosis versus action, because it's like something that we use, but I feel that what you are challenging us to do is that we have to work at the 4 levels at the same time. right?
I think you want to go there. I think it is the case that you can use the flame as a diagnostic lens, though. You can say, and the image that we use, the flame image that we use, talks about starting from the top and going down, starting from the actions and the patterns and the observable things, and saying, what patterns do we see? What symptoms do we see? And what do we like about them and what do we not like? What's working and not working at the level of the symptoms? Very useful to just do that. What's driving that? Next question is structure. Why those symptoms and not some other set of symptoms? Very useful to ask that. What's the quality of atmosphere that's behind those factors? Why is that way and not some other way? And then who are we being right now? Who are we being right now so that we're getting this result? Well, we're being 3 or 4 different subgroups who are competing with each other, who have a tone of competition and scarcity, who therefore have structures that aren't entirely aligned, and then producing results that we don't like. Going down the flame as a diagnostic lens is very useful and a direction we recommend. You know, and an example, just to give you a quick example of it. Some years ago, we did an analysis in a very large scale company, a very large oil and gas company, where there had been a major accident and very dangerous situation, and safety was a big concern in this company. And we said, what were the symptoms? Well, there was this accident and there's various things that had occurred. Why? What were the structures that allowed that to happen? Well, the way this particular situation had gotten set up, 3 or 4 different suppliers had provided the materials to build this particular physical structure, and they hadn't coordinated with each other. And the reason they hadn't coordinated with each other terribly was because the company had made the assumption that the suppliers were smarter than they were about their particular expertise. So they left it to the experts. But that produced a fragmented pattern of intelligence. The mood, the tone underneath that was, we're spending a lot of money on this. We got to get this to market as quickly as possible. So there was a huge pressure to deliver, right? And a feeling of no tolerance for error. So lots of pressure. And what was the identity? The identity was, we're not operators. We're not, technical people. We're financial people that control assets and make deals. So they had disconnected themselves from the actual physical operational reality that they were managing. So this is a very large scale sort of problem, large scale kind of infrastructure. And they'd essentially stepped away from responsibility to manage it in a direct manner. And as they did this analysis, it became very obvious that their way of thinking about things had contributed to the accident. You know, it wasn't just that they didn't have the right procedures in place. They had stepped away from, outsourced, and taken and just devolved responsibility for things that they once held, and that had created the difficulty.
Super interesting, and I was going to talk, to ask about some examples, but I think the way you're painting the picture, it's very clear. So of course, I think at Imago we use the flame as a tool to really understand an organization in depth, and also to help them realize sometimes the misalignments that there are, so they can actively work on some of them. Since the inception of the flame, has your thinking on this evolved, and what are maybe other ways to understand organizational effectiveness and alignment that you have come up with?
Well, the thinking has evolved in a couple of ways. One is we're much more focused on design than on diagnosis. It's very obvious. It's become very obvious that the secret to success, it's partly to understand what are you dealing with, but then to begin to think, how would we design the patterns of interaction so that the results everybody wants are a natural outcome of how everybody's interacting. So design in the sense of not just, the organizational boxes and responsibilities that might get set up, but the design of the experience. Say you have a group of people who are interacting in a manner that is not optimal. Maybe they're having a conflict with each other in some way. You know that if you simply put them together, they'll probably rehearse the conflict they already have. Well, how would you create a context where that wouldn't be the case? You might want to say, you have to think about each individual in two ways. What are the possibilities here given the constraints? And what's the potential that has yet been, has as yet to emerge? How would we work with each individual, say, and each subgroup to move them from a place of either resistance to change or conviction that they had the right answer, whatever the challenge was, to something else? So design is about how do you design the interventions, design the shifts, recognizing that human beings, people say people resist change. It's not true. They protect themselves from being assaulted by factors that they determine will hurt them, which is very rational. So design has to take into account the protective energy that people bring to the party. Who's protecting whom? What are people protecting? So one big piece of design is to pay attention to the protective energies that people are going to be bringing into the situation, not to condemn them or discount them or ignore them, but to listen. And the protective energies in people, once they actually sense what, once people sense that somebody's actually paying attention to that stuff, it tends to relax a bit. They tend to get stronger when people attribute that there's, no awareness. So design at many levels has a hugely significant thing. The other change that's occurred, and much more could be said about that. The other change that's occurred is we're thinking much more carefully now, and I'm thinking much more carefully about the flame as a personal and collective, particularly personal, transformational process. And I'm thinking about this relative to the idea that the flame points to 4 thresholds that human beings have to get over in order to make progress. First is the threshold of reactivity, the threshold of reacting to events, to action. We don't just have actions, we react to action. But then there's a threshold of being bamboozled and hypnotized by all the different information and structures that are around. What do you believe? How do you even know what to think? We are hypnotized by all this stuff, and there's a lot of echo chamber talk, people talking to and listening to their own world, and not knowing not trusting what else is out there. So we have to figure out how to overcome hypnosis, which is a particular kind of structure of thought. We live in a moment where there's been a big illusion of separation. The main tone has been that, I'm over here and you're over there. It's a big illusion. And and the feeling of isolation flows with that. And that's another big threshold that we're being forced in various ways to overcome. Because, for instance, we're noticing that the climate doesn't particularly care about national boundaries. It just is what it is. And the flame also points us, I think, to the threshold of identity in the sense of recovering a sense of self, something that's solid, that's not tossed with the wind and with every wave, but it has some kind of stability, some kind of quality of steadiness that is not caught in reactivity or illusions, but is nevertheless providing some kind of orientation point for oneself and for others. So there's a personal set of factors that the flame, I think, points us to also.
Are these four thresholds, are they mapped to different parts of the flame, or are there just the joint product of thinking of the flame as?
No, I think they map quite specifically to the 4 layers of the flame. The first, the action threshold is reactivity, and the structured threshold is hypnotic, overcoming the hypnosis of the structures in our lives. Yeah. And the isolation or separation threshold is recognizing that tone connects. And the last threshold is, I sometimes describe it as losing amnesia. We've forgotten who we are. And so we're running around looking for trying to find ourselves, when the quest to look is itself the problem.
I'm really curious about the idea that you put forward in terms of like self-protection and self-preservation, and how that's, sometimes what doesn't allow us to, both individually and organizationally, to actually bring about transformation. Could you speak a little bit more about that? Like, I think it's so relevant for the work that we do.
I think as people who are interested in trying to effect change and trying to understand how shifts occur, particularly collectively, we've been doing a lot of thinking about this lately. There's a correlate internally, personally, and collectively. When you see people fighting for their own particular, point of view, that is an act of self-protection, right? Now, sometimes it leads to behavior that looks difficult, confrontational, and it's easy to, and we don't want to advocate that they express that energy in that way, but we can understand it, right? It's ultimately about the feeling that somebody is stepping on their dignity, their own sense of value, etc. And we all have this, right? You show up in any context, there's always factors that are protective, always parts of us that want to keep us safe. And there's other parts of us that try and manage all of that. So there's a whole active, let's keep the lid on this situation and not let it get out of control. So in other words, there are internal factors in us that are busy trying to keep things from blowing up. Now, if you have that understanding and have some compassion for that reality and respect for it, you don't come trotting in, saying, oh, it's all wrong, this got to go. It's quite the opposite. It looks this way for some really good reasons. It looks this way for some excellent reasons. It's even, you could even say it's perfect. In other words, it couldn't be any other way, or it would be. The minute you take that attitude, that it's somehow fine, you then begin to, and you bring some compassion to it, you then begin to see the possibility, you can then begin to see possibilities. And the people in a situation will often sense that there are other possibilities. You're not there to condemn what they're doing. You actually understand why it's that way. They don't want to be stuck in their own self-protective energies either, by the way. Who does? They just don't see any alternative, right? In fact, they may be quite despairing and thinking there's no choice. Well, there is. I think the most exciting thing that we've been seeing over the last few years is the remarkable transformations that are possible in very short periods of time, when more of the energy of the bottom of the flame is brought online. What looked intractable and self-protective and super difficult changes, and almost beyond, at a speed that you would never think possible. But not until the protective energies are held and allowed to abate, and the people have become aware of this is the case, and be able to do something about it. So there's a lot to learn, I think, here about how to allow these collective patterns to shift. And I think they are much more shiftable than people think.
Once there is that awareness, right? Like, what, from your perspective and your experience, what are the next step, like the next step. Like I think sometimes at Imago we work a lot on, like surfacing some strategic tensions that we see, right? That like start to speak to some of what you've been talking about. How do you take it even further after the awareness comes in?
Well, I can say something sort of more generally. I mean, the answers tend to be very specific to the situation. What I can say here is that you want to do a couple of things to give people confidence that it's possible to move in a new way. So often, for instance, we'll come up with, we'll generate some new awareness, and then we'll come up with things to do, action steps about how to, and there's a slight inward groan and eye roll when these things happen, because mostly what people come up with, they've thought of before, and they think to themselves, well, this doesn't really do very much, and what has to happen is something slightly different, which is to come up with moves to make from the new awareness that would signal to everyone that we are in fact interested in a new way of operating. You're building a new language. So it's not just that we're doing new things. The things we're doing have new meaning. If we do these few simple things, now when we do them, it means we're committing ourselves to a different way of operating. So the things to do need to be concrete enough so that we can recognize that we're doing them, but they don't have to be too big as first. They have to be concrete. But the more important thing is we're generating a language that signals a new level of commitment and a new level of contribution. So when people see action, collectively, they see action coming out of whatever new awareness, they say, that's us taking this seriously. Now that's different. In other words, they've reframed what they're doing and have built a new way of operating. So there's a number of steps here, from unfreezing and making space for the protective energies, liberating that so new possibilities become clear, generating confident building concrete steps, and then putting new language, acknowledging that this is the building of a new language for confidence and for taking action.
Wonderful. So I think, honestly, I think we could have many more questions and continue this conversation further. Probably we'll reach out for a part two of this conversation.